It's a story that happened on the 9th of September, where a lady was scheduled to have an emergency treatment for a life-threatening condition at Dusseldorf University Hospital in Germany. And the hospital was hit with ransomware, which disrupted the whole IT network and the emergency care systems. And as a result, the patient needed to be transferred to another hospital 30 kilometers away. And in the process, she passed away while she was being transferred from hospital to hospital. And the German authorities who investigated the incident found that the attackers took advantage of a vulnerability in the hospital's Citrix VPN software that was reported back in January, but the hospital hadn't yet been able to patch the vulnerability. And this story stood out to me for a couple of reasons. The first was that this is a death that's directly linked to a cyber attack. And the second was that the hospital that was affected wasn't actually the intended target of the cyber attack either. So unfortunately, the hackers actually withdrew their ransom when they found out that a hospital had been targeted, and they actually provided the key to decrypt the data to the hospital. But it really highlights the importance of staying up to date with vulnerabilities, and the fact that fixing vulnerabilities has never been so important. Today, it's actually a matter of life or death. And during 2020, as the world's been going through COVID and there's been a lot more pressure on healthcare facilities, it's never been so important for us to think about cybersecurity, as criminals are really looking for targets that are going to be able to give them the most economic return. And hospitals really are that easy target. They're not super well resourced, and they're going to pay the ransom because they need to keep doing their important work to save people's lives. And in Australia as well, we've also seen some major breaches this year with attackers targeting a variety of organizations since the beginning of COVID. And just in the first half of 2020, the OAIC in Australia, under Australia's notifiable data breach scheme, reported that there was 518 breaches just in Australia in the first 6 months of this year. So it's really not just a global issue, it's also a domestic issue that's really important in Australia for us to look at. And there's a few key challenges which we encounter when, or we see with, or when we talk to organizations and look at how technology is moving, with organizations moving into the cloud and moving towards more of a hybrid architecture, especially not just with all the employees working from home and data not just sitting on your corporate devices in your data center anymore. The first challenge we see is that attackers are using real and legitimate identities to bypass network-based controls. You know, in the traditional network-based on-prem architecture, we depended a lot on those network-based controls like firewalls, IDS, IPS, to detect a lot of network-centric attacks. Whereas now attackers, they realize the issues with that sort of model, and all it really requires is them to use something like a phishing attack, and they have a foothold on your internal on-prem based network. The second issue or challenge we see is that passwords aren't enough anymore to protect identities. I mean, they never really have been, but a single factor of authentication or a password, it's so easy for this sort of information to be leaked or stolen, and it's not enough assurance to prove who someone is, especially if you're accessing a system over the internet and not on the corporate network anymore. And the third issue we really see is that, like I mentioned, identities are being used outside the corporate network. We are accessing systems from home. We're using cloud-based systems now, and network-based controls aren't necessarily effective for the kinds of attacks that we're seeing, and the new types of working arrangements that companies are putting in place. So from our experience helping customers recover from attacks through our incident response and compromise recovery engagements over many years, our team has a pretty good idea of what a typical attack pattern looks like. And we see a lot of attacks still targeting users and exploiting those traditional on-premises network structures. So generally, I'm just going to run through the process, and you might think, yeah, this is kind of network sort of on-prem centric, but that's because it really is kind of the low-hanging fruit in a lot of organizations that we see. So generally what an attacker is able to do is there's sort of a first stage of the attack, which is the beachhead. It's basically the initial entry into the network. And this usually involves some kind of phishing attack, maybe a drive-by download. Essentially, some kind of malware or toolkit is dropped into an end user device. And from there, once an attacker gets their initial access in the environment, there's a period of lateral movement, which essentially means that once they get access onto that first machine, the attacker is going to start stealing credentials, and usually if they're able to get a tool set like Mimikatz onto a computer, this allows them to extract all the local and domain credentials from that system, and they basically use the passwords or hashes or Kerberos tickets to move from system to system, continuing to extract credentials from each of those systems until they reach a system which has a set of privileged credentials in memory. So this leads us to the third phase of the attack lifecycle, which is privilege escalation. So once the attackers have a set of privileged credentials, and this could be something like a domain admin account that's in memory, where an admin has been able to log on to that computer, that's basically the highest level of privileges in a Windows-based environment. So from this point, it's kind of game over, because the attacker is now able to execute their mission, whether that's to steal data or disrupt business operations, or maybe just to persist in the environment for an extended period of time and keep watching what's going on. So Microsoft has observed that usually it only takes an adversary 24 to 48 hours to proceed through the attack lifecycle, from the initial compromise to being able to execute on the attacker's mission, to be able to get that high level of privileges. And our goal as defenders is really to increase the cost and time required for an attacker to proceed through the attack lifecycle and action on their objectives. So we really focus on how we can detect and contain that attack as quickly as possible and limit the impact. So I'm going to hand over to Katherine now, and she's going to talk a bit more about some attack trends and a bit more about incident response.
Thanks, Bron. I'll let you drive. Yes. Sorry, guys. My webcam is here and the slide is here, so you'll see my face get tilted from time to time. So based on what Bron has said, and an interesting story, the news that Bron has read before, I actually read a slightly different story the other day, where the attacker group, they're actually a ransomware again. They go by the name DarkSide. They have donated a portion of their ransom to a child poverty charity, and also a water project charity, which helps people to get clean and reliable water. And they claim that they only hack global, high-profile, profitable organizations. Now, they are not the first ransomware again that does that. They have been, over the years, there have been other ransomware groups that claim that they only hack profitable organizations to benefit the greater society. Now, this ransomware, this also stays a trend of the attack trend from a signature malware to commodity malware, where essentially you can just buy it off the shelf and deploy a quick cyber attack. So platforms like Philadelphia, which is actually a ransomware as a service platform, it offers the adversary groups sophisticated malware or ransomware campaign, which they can launch and deploy, making deploying ransomware attack as easy as ordering a pizza. Now, the focus and another increasing trend we see these days is human-operated ransomware, right? So what is human-operated ransomware? They are more hands-on keyboard attacks, which are different from the ransomware which has the nature of auto spread, like WannaCry or like WannaCry. And in this human-operated ransomware, the adversaries employ credential theft and lateral movement techniques, which are traditionally associated with targeted attacks like those from nation-state actors. And these attacks take advantage of network misconfiguration and vulnerabilities. So if you have a web server that hasn't been patched and it has the latest vulnerability, then the attacker will most likely exploit that. And while ransomware is very visible, right? Human operators also deliver other malicious payloads. They steal credentials, they harvest credentials, and they access and exfiltrate data from the customer's network. So normally how it starts is human-operated ransomware campaigns. They often start with commodity malware like banking trojans or other what you may call unsophisticated attack vectors that typically triggers multiple detection alerts. However, those alerts tend to be triaged as unimportant, so they won't be thoroughly investigated and remediated. Then the payloads are frequently stopped by antivirus solutions, but attackers, they just deploy a different payload or use admin access to disable the AV without attracting much attention. So in this slide, you can also see the common attack techniques we have, where the attacker, with their initial recon, the entry is through misconfigured or outed web servers. They deploy their deployment through commodity malware. They find and exploit the poor security controls and find ways to bypass them. They harvest credentials, and then they use lateral movement and also data exfiltration to move critical IPs or patents of a company outside. So what are some of the defenses we can take? So very, very basic, and I know this sounds so basic, you probably hear it every day in every security conference or workshops, is MFA, right? You have to build your credential hygiene. Now, physical perimeter is not a thing anymore, right? Nowadays, we talk about identity security perimeter. So, and that means you have to build your credential hygiene. You can't have 300 plus domain admins sitting there, right? And that is like an invitation to ask attackers to pop you. And also, you have to harden your infrastructure, really clean up your domain controller, your AD environment, secure internet-facing assets, right? Because that's the most vulnerable public-facing. That's what we call an edge. That's like a public-facing where you move from internal to external. And really include IT professionals in security discussions. So your architect team or your admin team can really understand from a security point of view what controls do we need to have in place. And monitoring, monitoring for adversary activities, for the C2 channels, use threat intelligence, or what we call, or if it's not, you're not at the intelligence level, what we call threat signals, to see, oh, these are the APT group that actually applicable to my organization, to my industry, so that's why we need to monitor their TTPs. Okay, now moving on to the instance response slide. Now in this section, we're going to talk about how Microsoft does incident response and focus on how we do compromise recovery. Now, talking about incident response, different companies does it differently, right? And it has different meanings. Like we do it will be different from, let's say, your company internally, how you do it. So in Microsoft's context, which generally aligns with the industry standard, is instant responders. They are first on the scene, right? They get a call, they jump on a plane, and they get to the customer side, and they review the data, determine the scope of the incident, how many workstations, how many are compromised, how many accounts are compromised, what's the backdoor the attacker used, and what's the C2 channel the attacker used to beacon outside. And then they do containment, right? They contain the damage and prevent further damage to spread across the customer's network. So we figure out, again, how did the attacker get in? What's the backdoor? Which systems and accounts are compromised? So that's your accounts. And what's the information that's been stolen? Is it like a high intellectual property that has been already been exfiltrated out? Is your whole NTDS database has been exfiltrated out? And what attacker tools are used? And then the output of incident response, we will have what we call an IR report, which will cover the ABCs. We just talk about the accounts that have been compromised, the backdoors that used to exploit, and also the C2 channels, your IPs, your URLs, your domains, and file hashes. And then it will recommend the next steps, which is normally followed by a in-depth, comprehensive compromise recovery process. Now, looking at the whole incident response and compromise process, approach. So in Microsoft way, to summarize, right? In Microsoft's world, incident response in one sentence is we focus on breadth over depth, and our compromise recovery approach in one sentence to summarize is we bring the domain trust back and evict the attacker. So looking at the incident response process, we have 4 phases. Detection phase. Detection phase is where either the customer provided us with the malware sample or our hunters, they have detected the sample. Then moving on to research. So we look at this sample malware and we say, oh, is it a known sample? Is it something we've never seen? And we conduct further analysis. Then moving on to threat analysis. So this is where we engage either a reverse engineer team or our forensic analyst team, or both. So reverse engineering, they do the review of the whole file, right? They use tools to really look at how to decode the malware. Forensic analysis, they do more of analysis on the box. So before the malware got on this box, what happened and what happened after. Now, then moving on to disposition, where we have, I'll give you the timeline of events. Where did the attacker first set foot into the customer's network till this date, right? So what's the impact and the timeline? And we also have, we'll give conclusions like, oh, are there any new patterns detected? So that's a high level of the IR approach. Moving on to the CR approach, so in the compromise recovery approach, and I just said and Bronwyn will go into detail later on, is in the CR approach, what we actually do is we want to evict the attacker, want to bring the trust of domain back. So we will remove adversary presence. We'll harden defense. So harden defense as in we'll deploy our Microsoft patented tool, and we will look at the AD configuration. We'll look at the accounts. We'll look at how is privileges or echoes set in Active Directory environment. We will, throughout this whole compromise recovery process, we'll always have monitoring. We'll have one dedicated monitoring consultant to review the ABCs, the accounts, the domains in scope, the activities on the critical domains, the C2 channels, and to give the full visibility of what's happening. And lastly, in compromise recovery, where we'll normally have what we call eviction days, where we actually restore the trust back and clean up the identities, clean up the misconfigurations. Okay, now handing over to Bron to go in detail of the compromise recovery approach. Up to you, Bron.
Thanks, Katherine. So that was a really good overview of especially the difference between incident response and compromise recovery, because I think we hear a lot about incident response and that sort of process following a cybersecurity incident or a breach, but not so much about the recovery phase, which is actually it requires a lot more work than incident response, because during the investigation, we found out the scope of the incident, how the attackers got in, and maybe just stop the bleeding. But there's usually still quite a lot of work to do to get the business back to a good, stable state, and to make sure that the attacker isn't just going to walk back through the door tomorrow using the same vulnerability that they used in the first place to get access to the environment. So we have a few main goals in compromise recovery. The first is to remove adversary control. And so usually when companies go through a cyber attack, they're really keen to start taking actions immediately to remediate vulnerabilities, to start doing big password resets and trying to get rid of the attacker. But what we commonly see is that companies don't really take a coordinated approach. And so what it can mean is you can end up leaving gaps in terms of the accounts, backdoors, and command and control channels, which an attacker can use again to regain access to the environment. So our first step is that we actually take a step back and we look at the results of the IR report and how the attacker got in the first place. And we basically put together a plan based on the findings to look at things like, what kind of attack was it? Was it a nation state attacker, or was this a ransomware attack? Were they using commodity malware, or was this something that was more using like targeted specific zero-day sort of material? So we're really making sure that we remove all of the avenues for persistence rather than taking what we call like a whack-a-mole approach. The second goal we have is that we want to restore trust in the identity system. And generally this is Active Directory in an on-prem environment, providing all the authentication and authorization services for most of the systems in the organization. In order to restore trust, we look for high-risk configurations in Active Directory that can be used by an attacker to get a high level of privileges in the environment. And we also review the management of privileged credentials and implement some controls to make it difficult for an attacker to get a high level of privileges in the environment. And lastly, we harden defenses against recompromise. So this generally includes a combination of technology and process controls to increase the resilience of the customer so that they're better equipped to prevent, detect, and respond to attacks in the future. We also look at reducing the attack surface by reducing lateral movement paths in the environment, and looking for things like patching processes and working on maturing some of the detection response, so that once we leave and we're not there during our 6 to 8 week engagement, the customer can keep monitoring and looking for signs of suspicious activity. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail now about what specifically we actually look at. And so in most of Microsoft's IR investigations, the team finds that the adversary has been able to gain a higher level of privileges in an environment. As I mentioned in the earlier sort of attack timeline, generally attackers are looking for domain admin sort of privileges, which will give them free reign over all the data and systems in an organization's environment. And this allows them to steal data, move laterally within the network, and remain undiscovered for an extended period of time without detection. So when it comes to our team coming in to help with recovery, one of the first things we look at is who has privileges in the environment. And there's many places in an enterprise environment where privileged credentials exist. It may be the business system owners having credentials on their applications or their systems. It could be, your cloud system admins who have they have root permissions on the cloud systems rather than just having resource-based permissions, or it could be your identity system admins, like your Active Directory admins, who you have too many admins in privileged groups, or that haven't been cleaned out for a really long time, and they all provide risks and paths for privilege escalation. So in particular, we focus on identity system admins because, as we mentioned, this is the source for authentication and authorization services within the whole environment. So the second thing we're interested in is not just who has permissions, but where are credentials being used? And we saw earlier in the session that attackers in the attack timeline, they move from computer to computer, looking for credentials that are stored in memory on a system in order to escalate their privileges. So this is because when you log into a Windows system, the computer stores a hash or a Kerberos ticket in memory so that you don't have to enter your credentials every time you want to access a resource on the domain. It's kind of like a single sign-on functionality. But what we see in like as a common scenario in customer environments is you might have, say, your sysadmin who's called Joe, and he's responsible for managing all of the organization's identity systems, as well as a variety of other critical business applications. And at the start of the day, he logs on to his regular user desktop with his standard user credentials, where he's doing his web browsing, he's doing his email checking, and all his regular kind of productivity tasks. And then he connects into a jump host with his privilege credentials, and then from there he's able to connect into all the more sensitive critical business systems that he's going to manage. So what you might not realize is that every system he connects to or logs into with his privilege credentials leaves a trace of his credentials in memory, which leaves them exposed to credential theft attacks, which is really heavily used by attackers as part of their lateral movement techniques. So this is a really common administration scenario we see in many organizations' environments. And the problem we see here is that attackers are getting pretty savvy. They kind of know the kinds of patterns that admins are using to do their administrative tasks. And all it takes is for an attacker to get a keylogger or some kind of malware or toolset onto Joe's original workstation to be able to capture his credentials either as he enters them or to be able to capture his session that's going on that regular user workstation. And some organizations implement multi-factor authentication to deal with this risk, but we see that MFA doesn't necessarily help with this because there's actually other paths to Active Directory using other protocols like LDAP, WMI, and WinRM, which can't natively be restricted using MFA. So really there's always these privilege escalation paths wherever an admin is logging on and leaving their credentials in memory. So in order to deal with this, the exposure of privileged credentials to less sensitive systems, we deploy some controls into Active Directory as part of a compromise recovery project. The first control that we deploy is called the Microsoft Tiered Administration Model. And basically it's a control that groups privileged credentials so that they can only log on to a single tier. And this limits an attacker's ability to elevate their privileges if they successfully compromise a less sensitive device on your network. So basically this consists of a combination of group policies and logon restrictions, which ensure that what we call a tier 0 admin or an Active Directory admin can't log on to an application server or a workstation. So let's talk about jumps boxes. Once you've got tiers in place, how do you access a tier 0 system from tier 2? Well, we have this concept called a privileged access workstation, which is basically a dedicated workstation which you can use to access your tier 0 resources. And a privileged access workstation, or a POR as we call it, is hardened, monitored. It doesn't have any internet, it doesn't have any email. And basically, when you implement a POR device, your credentials are only exposed to a device that's at the same tier. So there's really no opportunity for an attacker to grab those credentials and be able to escalate to get access over your identity systems. Now I want to have I just want to go through a few of the other controls and issues which we see as part of our projects, which are really focused on identity systems, but some of the hardening that we look at as part of our response. And it is very focused on Active Directory, I'm not going to lie. So if you haven't come across Active Directory much in the past, hopefully you can apply these to whatever kind of system or however you're managing things in your environment. So the first issue, the first thing we look at is credential hygiene. So often we see that as part of our cleanup and the recovery process, we see issues like weak password policies, service accounts with huge amounts of permissions. We see a lot of insecure account attributes, like accounts that have password never expires, that haven't been reset since 1999, and unconstrained delegation of credentials, which means basically once you log onto a server, that server can impersonate you within the environment. The second lot of issues that we see and we try and clean up are AD infrastructure issues. And this can include things like domain controllers missing critical patches, AD trusts between different domains and forests, which are completely insecure, which means that potentially if you have a service provider managing infrastructure, if that service provider gets compromised, it's a really easy path for an attacker to move from the service provider into your environment. Some other things that we look at are special accounts like the Kerberos master account, the Kerb TGT account, which is basically responsible for signing all the Kerberos tickets in your Windows domain. Attackers often target this account as well because it allows them to impersonate any account in your environment. So we look at how do we effectively reset this account as part of a compromised recovery engagement so that we can re-establish trust in your identity system and all the authentication protocols that are used in a Windows-based environment. And we also look at the Active Directory structure permissions and all the ACLs that provide permission in different areas of the Active Directory structure. And finally, the last area we look at hardening is endpoint. So we don't focus a lot on this, but because we're mainly focusing on the identity system, but as part of our cleanup efforts in recovering the organization, we look at end user workstations and systems, which are sort of the front line of the attack. Usually attacks are coming in via phishing or browsers on those end user workstations. So we look at things like cleaning up legacy protocols like wdigest, which store clear text passwords in memory, looking at changing the local admin password on systems, which attackers often use to move laterally from system to system in an environment, and looking at things like do users have local admin access on the endpoints? That's not great because once the malware gets onto the endpoint, it's just going to run without admin privileges as well. So I'm going to hand over to, I basically covered a few of the things we do in cleaning up, especially looking at privileges in Active Directory and cleaning up the environment. But I'm going to hand over to Katherine now, who's going to go through a bit more about the monitoring that we do as part of compromised recovery to kind of detect and keep an eye on what's going on in the environment and quickly be able to block attacker activity.
Yep, thanks, Bron. Now I will talk about technical monitoring, or we call like the monitoring piece specifically in CR, in compromise recovery. So Bron, if you can move to the next slide. So we're speaking of monitoring, right? Especially under a situation where the company got popped, then what's the if they are engaged with MSSP, then how is their MSSP trained to respond and to provide monitoring throughout compromise recovery? And if the company is using their network team or their network operations team, the NOC team as their SOC team, then are they trained to actually take over the monitoring position to throughout the compromise recovery phase, where they can provide full security visibility? And lastly, what's the value of monitoring in compromise recovery, right? So essentially the goal is that when we do a compromise recovery, as Bron just went in depth, we have different phases. We review the Active Directory environment, review accounts, you review all that misconfiguration, all that settings. Well, monitoring give you another layer of your risk profile and your visibility. So why do I say that? So I was at this customer a while ago, and they have actually engaged our Dart team, which is our IR team, twice. And they deployed our Azure ATP and Defender ATP tool for around 6-7 months. And they're using their network team, or the NOC team, as their SOC team. And across this 6-7 months, they have over 2,000 alerts on their Azure ATP portal. That's pretty bad. And they have resolved 2 of them across 6 months. Right, so this is a typical example where we see the customer, they don't really have a mature or capable SOC practice in general, and they definitely do not have the capability to do it in a CR, in an intense compromise recovery scenario. So the goal of monitoring is we monitor suspicious activities of the tier 0 servers and workstations, of some of the critical tier 1 servers as well. We monitor the ABCs. Again, you hear me talking about ABC several times because they are the attack avenues where we have the accounts being compromised, the backdoors being exploited, and the C2 channels being used. And we block C2 traffic and lateral movement, right? We can block it in our Microsoft tools. And we can monitor different activities on our asset and monitor Hardening token activities. We can monitor our critical tier 0 admin activities as well. And this is a list of tools we have Microsoft offer as a security monitoring solutions. So, but I don't really want to turn it into a sales pitch. So I just briefly cover each of them. So Azure ATP is our one of our core monitoring solutions, which provides monitoring for Active Directory domain controllers. Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, which is, judging by the name, is our EDR EPP solution. MCAS is our CASB. Office 365 ATP is a ATP specifically built for Office 365. Azure Security Center is overall cloud or on-prem VM, how to monitor their security posture and risk profile. Azure Sentinel Log Analytics Workspace is our SIEM solution. And we have different scenarios. We have different around 5 or 6 scenarios, I'd say, that depending on the customer, sometimes the customer have nothing, right? So depending on what they have, what Microsoft monitoring solutions they have deployed, we will combine different solutions and we will do different monitoring, hunting, and analysis on those portals. So today I will just talk about a typical combination of monitoring tools, which is Azure ATP and Defender for Endpoint. So why are they a common combination? Because Azure ATP, as I just mentioned, it's a cloud-based security solution that basically leverages on-prem AD signals to identify the threats across the kill chain, right, from reconnaissance to domain dominance. We monitor alerts such as brute force attempts, monitor past the ticket, overpass the hash attacks. So this covers the attacks or threats on your domain controller side. Now, Defender for Endpoint, on the other hand, is really covering your EDR solution, where it covers the attacks that happens on your workstations. So let's say if a suspicious attacker tool has been downloaded, for example, Mimikatz has been detected on this workstation. So that's what Defender will give you alert or instant on. And another good thing about Defender, again, not to turn into a sales pitch, I'll just briefly touch on, is Defender actually covers multi-stage attack. So what that means is someone at a workstation or endpoint workstation where you have reconnaissance, you have PE, privilege escalation, you have lateral movement, and the Defender will automatically group all these alerts together into one instant. So it's easy for you to review and triage and resolve this whole incident, because it flows throughout the kill chain. Now, moving on to the next slide. So what are they in CR scenario, right? We just talked them about these two tools in general, how do we use them? And in CR, of course, first of all, we need to onboard our critical systems, our tier 0 assets, and known compromised machines to the Defender endpoint, and to make sure we have Azure ATP sensors installed. And make sure we also set up IOCs, so the file hashes, the IPs, the URLs, domain names, which we get from the instance response report, and we set them up in the in this case is a Defender for Endpoint portal. And then when we look at the alerts, there are really two things, right? Two big critical things we need to look at. First of all is the sensor or agent health, right? So with Azure ATP, we have Azure ATP sensor that you need to make sure that healthy is up and running. So otherwise there's no telemetry sent to the portal, right? If there's any issues with the sensor health, we need to triage, address that immediately. Same for Defender for Endpoint, where we need to look at the MMA agent and triage if it's down or if it's there's issues reporting. And then we're really looking at on different platforms. So really looking at this for example, I don't know what you can actually see. Sorry, that's the screenshot is a bit small. It's really the first screenshot to give you the a view of what alerts can be are we detecting on the Azure ATP portal, which is past the hash or past the hash. Type alerts where you have ticket manipulation, Kerberos ticket manipulation. And then we can actually, for example, you find that DC or you find a suspicious activity on one workstation, you can actually look up that workstation in the Defender for Endpoint portal to see if they have any relevant alerts or any high, medium alerts for that endpoint itself. Now, the second screenshot, which covers the high incident. So basically, we will look at the high and medium severity incidents, and then review each alert under each high incident and see, okay, have the full picture of what happened. And just, Bron, if you could just click twice. Yeah. So this basically gives you a timeline of events of what happened, and also just did some really basic advanced hunting on the portal where we see, so this incident is a malicious credential theft tool detected. So we want to investigate this file. So you basically, what you investigate, you want to investigate the IP URL and the file hash. So we can literally just search for the file hash, see what other alerts are related to this file hash and what other endpoints are affected. All right, so that's essentially what we in overview, very high level overview of what we do in different portals. Of course, we have when we actually do it, we were adding a lot of other things, like how do we automate this reporting generation, because we don't want to, we will want to improve efficiency. We want to make sure that all these high severity alerts are immediately notified to the customer. And we also want to make sure that we are giving the customer this full visibility of what happened, and also help them to triage and resolve these alerts, so that after the compromise recovery phase, they don't have to have the 2,000 plus alerts hanging in their portal where no one is really looking at it. So it's actually worked really well for us. So that customer where they have 2,000 plus alerts, after a week of working with them, they resolved over 1,000 of them. So that's how you see how we bring value into compromise recovery, is really depending on the customer stock maturity, and then they will decide how much help they will need from Microsoft, that we can really provide some value in helping them to understand these critical alerts, and helping them to understand moving on, going forward, what do they need to do. Okay, I'll hand over to Bron to go over the last section of how do we prevent a compromise.
Awesome. Thanks, Katherine. That was really good. We're going to go on to the last section now, which is about how do you prevent a compromise? And this is actually a bit of a trick question, because even if you have an excellent security program, you still won't be able to stop every single attack. We actually have this sort of mindset shift in the industry now, from approaching security from trying to prevent every single attack, now to changing to a assume compromise approach, which basically sort of advocates for assuming that a motivated and well-resourced attacker will usually be able to get in. And so it also means that we shift our controls and our processes from focusing just on preventative controls to now equally focusing on prevention, detection, and response. So that, like, you might not be able to prevent every breach, but you can actually reduce the likelihood and mitigate the impact, so that if and when it does happen, it's not going to knock your business totally offline, and you will be able to recover in a shorter sort of time frame. So it's interesting thinking about breaches these days. There's been, like we mentioned earlier, a huge number of breaches which have been caused by simple things like user error, misconfiguration. But in security, we love hearing about those interesting breaches, don't we all? And the media also loves to talk about interesting breaches where nation state attackers break in and steal all the data, and they sell stuff on the dark web, and it sounds super interesting. But unfortunately, the majority of attacks we see are actually caused by much less sexy things like human error and lack of basic security hygiene. So when we talk about how to prevent and how to detect attacks, a lot of it is actually really focused on how do we get the basics right. There's nothing more important. And when we look at the main sort of recommendations for strengthening your security posture and being able to prevent, detect, and respond to breaches, the first thing that we would recommend looking at is strengthening authentication. We spent a lot of time in this session talking about privileged accounts and managing your credentials and credential theft attacks. And that's because that is a reoccurring trend, and attackers continue to target legitimate credentials as part of their cyber attacks. So there's a few things in this area which you can go and do, which are separating out your regular user credentials and your privileged accounts, making sure that privileged accounts aren't being exposed to less sensitive systems where attackers can gather those credentials from memory and escalate their privileges. Secondly, implementing unique local administrator accounts on all of your systems, whether it's servers or workstations. Microsoft has a free tool called the Local Administrator Password Solution, which actually manages all your local admin passwords for you. And that integrates with Active Directory as well. And lastly, deploying MFA for all your admins, and also user authentication on internet-facing systems. And the second area we recommend looking at is trying to reduce the attack surface. So, you know, we heard about at the beginning how that hospital was targeted by ransomware because they were able to, the ransomware was able to exploit a vulnerability in their Citrix VPN. And I can't understate the importance of especially deploying critical security patches for your operating systems, browsers, and email in a timely manner, because ultimately attackers aren't always using those 0 days or kind of nation state targeted attacks. A lot of the time attackers are just in it for the money, and they're using commodity tool sets and vulnerabilities that haven't been patched for maybe 10 or more years. So it's important, yeah, just please patch things. And also make sure that you're backing up your important data and making sure that it's offline. So if you do get hit with ransomware, you can actually restore from those backups. And lastly, disable unnecessary legacy protocols. A lot of legacy protocols, especially in Windows, store credentials in plain text, and yeah, unfortunately, they still linger in many people's environments. And lastly, look at maturing your detection and response. I can't emphasize enough, monitor your identity systems and look out for credential theft attacks. It's actually a really high fidelity alert that you can look for that will give you a pretty good reward for your effort in terms of the kind of detections that tools like Azure ATP will be able to pick up. And finally, please have an incident response plan and test it regularly so that when you do go through a cybersecurity incident, you know what to do and you know who to call and who's going to be talking to the media or what the communications process is going to be. So it is a disruptive process, and it is important to plan for it. So we do have some resources that you can go and look at online. Microsoft has a whole lot of resources specifically around securing privileged access, which you can look at the link that's on this slide, which is aka.ms/SPA. And that includes some more detailed documentation around the Microsoft tiered administration model and privileged access workstations, as well as a full-on 30-day, 90-day and beyond roadmap for how you can secure privileged access. And finally, what do you do if you are under attack? Well, if you'd like to engage Microsoft's IR or compromise recovery team, there is actually incident response included as part of Premier Unified Support contracts. So if you do have a Premier or Unified Support contract with Microsoft, you can raise a severity A support ticket as part of that contract, or reach out to your CSAM, and they'll be more than happy to help with coordinating that response process. And then after the incident response, our team is more than happy to help to go through this whole recovery process with you.